The night Harriet Lorne decided she would stop waiting, she burned nothing, said nothing, and made no ceremony of it at all. She simply set down her embroidery hoop, looked out the tall window of her cousin's drawing-room at the frost-hardened garden below, and made a quiet, private decision, the way one closes a book one has read to its last page. Done. There was a particular relief in it, the same relief one felt walking away from a dressmaker's, after cancelling an order that had taken too long and cost too much. She was 29. In the language of the county, that meant she was already something to be accounted for, explained, apologized over. Her mother had stopped mentioning it aloud, which was somehow worse. Silence on the subject had replaced the gentle suggestions and the casual introductions. The Lorne name still carried itself upright. Barely. But everyone who mattered knew the Lorne estate was let to tenants, that her father's remaining years had been spent managing a slow retreat from comfort to respectability, and that Harriet herself came with a small portion and a great deal of composure. She did not lack for suitors entirely. There had been a solicitor in her 23rd year, a widower with 3 children, who had looked at her the way men looked at a piece of furniture, appreciating its utility. There had been a lieutenant in her 25th year who had admired her enormously until his regiment was posted north and his letters became occasional and then altogether stopped. And there had been one rather earnest curate who, she was fairly certain, had confused her with her cousin Philippa, a mistake that resolved itself when Philippa became available, and he promptly redirected his attentions. So on the night of the Caldwell assembly, when she folded her hands in her lap and made her quiet determination, she felt no grief. She felt something closer to relief. She would remain in her cousin's house through the season, attend the functions asked of her, be pleasant and unremarkable, and then return to the small cottage in Derbyshire that her father had left her, which was modest and draughty and utterly her own. She had not anticipated Lord Ashmore. She had not anticipated him because she had not known he would be at the assembly, and also because she had been told by no fewer than 3 separate sources that he never attended assemblies. He was the sort of man about whom a great deal was said and little was known directly. His title was old. The Ashmore earldom stretched back 2 centuries, and the estate in Northumberland was large enough that no one in the southern counties had ever seen it, which meant everyone in the southern counties felt free to imagine it as they liked. There were stories about the previous Lord Ashmore, his father, who had been a difficult man. There were fewer stories about the present one, and the stories that did exist were contradictory and probably embellished. He was, by all accounts, somewhere in his middle 30s. He had been married, briefly some years ago, to a woman who had died of a fever 2 winters into the marriage. He had no children. He ran his estate efficiently, attended Parliament when he was required to, and was otherwise absent from the kind of social life that generated the stories people liked to tell about men like him. Harriet had absorbed all of this the way one absorbs weather reports, with mild attention and no expectation of personal relevance. She noticed him because he was standing near the fireplace with an expression of such controlled courtesy that it appeared to require active effort. He was not scowling exactly, and not precisely smiling, and the conversation he was sustaining with a red-faced baronet seemed to be costing him something, though she could not have said what. He had dark eyes, not warm exactly, but observant in the way that good surveyors were observant, taking stock of everything without sentiment. She looked away. She was not in the business of forming impressions of men anymore. She had closed that particular ledger. What happened next was entirely unremarkable in its mechanics. Her cousin's eldest son, a boy of 11 who had been allowed to attend the first hour of the assembly as a special privilege, and was now drunk on the excitement of it, ran headlong into a footman carrying a tray of wine glasses. The crash was spectacular. Her cousin shrieked. The boy stood frozen in a sea of glass and spilled wine, looking as though he might cry. Harriet crossed the room before anyone else moved. She stepped carefully through the glass. She had good boots on, sensible ones, a fact she had been mildly embarrassed about all evening, and crouched down to the boy's level. "Don't move," she said quietly. "Not yet. Are your feet all right?" The boy, whose name was Frederick, stared at her with enormous eyes and then gave a small, terrified nod. "Good. Look at me, not at the floor. There's no point in looking at the floor. Now put your hand on my shoulder and step exactly where I step." She guided him clear of the glass. The footman had already begun collecting pieces with a cloth. A second servant appeared from somewhere with another cloth. The whole incident was over in 3 minutes. It was only when she straightened and looked up that she realized. Lord Ashmore was standing quite close by, having apparently abandoned the baronet at some point during the commotion. He was watching her with an expression she could not entirely classify. Not admiration exactly, not surprise exactly, but something quieter than both. "Well handled," he said. It was not a grand statement. It was not a compliment shaped for effect. It was simply the sentence that fit the moment, delivered without decoration, which she found she preferred to decoration. "He's a child who was startled," she said. "It required very little." "You'd be surprised," Lord Ashmore said, "how much very little is actually beyond most people." She did not have an answer for that immediately, which was unusual for her. She was saved from having to find one by her cousin, who descended on Frederick with a mix of relief and scolding that drove everything else from the moment. Lord Ashmore moved away. She did not see him again that evening. Her cousin's name was Mrs. Delverton, and she was a good woman who meant well and talked almost constantly. She had taken Harriet in for the season with genuine warmth, and she expressed that warmth primarily by arranging proximity to eligible men and then narrating the experience afterward, at length. The morning after the Caldwell assembly, over tea, she provided her full account of Lord Ashmore. "He spoke to you," she said, as though Harriet might have missed it. "Lord Ashmore, he spoke directly to you." "Briefly," Harriet said. "He doesn't speak to people." "Everyone says so. He stood with Sir Caldwell for 20 minutes and said perhaps 8 words." Mrs. Delverton's enthusiasm for the subject was considerable. "And he watched you after. I saw him. When you were talking to Frederick and calming him down, Lord Ashmore stood and watched the whole thing. He didn't go back to his conversation." Harriet poured her tea. "Mrs. Delverton, I'm only observing. I know you are. It's a very large estate, I'm aware, and he's not unkind, people who know him say. Only quiet. And he lost his wife very young, you know, which, well, it changes a person. Anyone would understand that." Harriet set her cup down. She looked at her cousin with genuine fondness and said, "I have decided not to hope any more this season. I want you to know that, so you're not worrying for me. I'm content. I would like to enjoy the rest of my time here and go home to Derbyshire in reasonable spirits." Mrs. Delverton looked at her with the expression of someone who had heard something unreasonable and was choosing to ignore it tactfully. "Of course, dear," she said, and poured herself more tea. That afternoon a card arrived, Lord Ashmore, with the compliments of the season and the request, if Miss Lorne had no prior engagement, of a brief call at her convenience. Harriet read it twice. She placed it face down on the writing table. She sat for a moment in the chair by the window. Then she picked it up and read it a third time, which told her nothing new, but gave her hands something to do. He called on Thursday. Mrs. Delverton received him in the drawing-room and then made a series of increasingly transparent excuses to absent herself, so that by the end of the first quarter hour, Harriet and Lord Ashmore were sitting on opposite sides of the room, in the kind of correct, supervised solitude that propriety technically permitted. He was easier to look at in daylight than she had expected. Not because his features were softer, they weren't, but because his attention was easier to hold without the noise of the assembly pressing on both sides. "I owe you an explanation," he said, which was not how she had expected him to begin. "For what?" she asked. "For calling." It was abrupt. "I'm not skilled at." He paused, looking briefly dissatisfied with whatever word he had been reaching for. "Preamble," he said finally. "I've found preamble is usually a way of saying something while seeming to say nothing," Harriet said. "You needn't apologize for skipping it." He looked at her for a moment. Not the assessing look from the assembly, but something more direct. "I wanted to speak with you again. That's the simple truth of it. I don't have a more graceful way to frame it. Then don't frame it more gracefully. What did you want to speak about?" "I don't know yet," he said, and there was something so plainly honest in it that she found herself almost smiling. They talked for an hour. It was not the kind of conversation she was accustomed to having with men in drawing rooms. It was not flattering, and it was not easy. He had opinions he stated directly, and then listened when she disagreed, which she did twice. Both times on matters he appeared to find genuinely interesting to reconsider. He asked about Derbyshire, not as a pleasantry. Not as a pleasantries, but because he had time in the Peak District in his 20s and had a specific memory of a particular road above Castleton that he wanted to know if she knew. She knew it. They spent 7 minutes on that road, and neither of them noticed the time passing. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Miss Lorne," he said, "would you walk with me on Saturday, if the weather holds?" She hesitated. One beat, no more. "Yes," she said, "if the weather holds." It held. The walks became a habit before either of them formally decided they would. Saturday, then Tuesday, then Saturday again. Harriet told herself each time that it was pleasant exercise and reasonable company, and that she was not constructing anything out of it, and that she had made her decision in the Caldwell drawing room, and she was keeping to it. She was fairly certain, lying to herself. He was not easy company in the conventional sense. He did not charm. He did not make light conversation or deploy the kind of smooth social language that most men of his rank had been trained in since boyhood. What he did instead was pay attention, real, complete attention, in a way that was slightly unnerving until one became accustomed to it. On their third walk, she mentioned, almost as an aside, that she had learned to manage the household accounts at 14. Because her father's eyesight had begun to fail and he had trusted her with them before he trusted anyone else. Lord Ashmore, she still thought of him that way. She had not moved to anything else. Stopped walking. "He gave that to a girl of 14, he said. "He gave it to me," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "there is." She did not know what to do with the way he said it, so she walked on, and he fell into step beside her, and neither of them mentioned it again. But she thought about it later, alone in her room, the way one thinks about something that has landed in exactly the right place. There were other conversations about his estate, which was, by his own account, demanding and complex, and a thing he had come to terms with loving without exactly wanting it. About his brother, who had died 3 years ago of an illness that took him quickly and left a gap that did not close. He told her that quietly, on a grey morning, when the path they were walking along was empty and the wind was off the moors. He did not dress it in any particular language. He simply said that his brother had been the person who knew him best, and that there were days when that absence was very loud. Harriet said nothing immediately. She let it sit in the air between them for a moment, which felt like the right thing to do. Then she said, "I think that kind of quiet is the loneliest there is, when you have something to say, and the person who would have understood it is gone." He turned to look at her, She was looking straight ahead at the path. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." They walked a long time after that without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. She knew something had changed when she stopped dreading her return to Derbyshire, not because she had stopped wanting the cottage. She still did. She would always want it. It was hers. But because she had begun, without meaning to, doing the arithmetic of how long the season lasted, and feeling something she refused to name in relation to the answer. Mrs. Delverton had stopped mentioning Lord Ashmore during morning tea because she had graduated to a state of such barely contained excitement that words were apparently insufficient. She simply looked at Harriet. Harriet looked back. They drank their tea. What Harriet had not told her cousin, because she had not yet told herself, was that she was afraid. Not of him, not of the future in any large and shapeless way, afraid of a very specific thing, that she had spent years training herself to want nothing, and that wanting something now felt dangerous, in the way that beginning to feel warmth in a cold room felt dangerous, like a thing that could be taken away. She did not know what Lord Ashmore intended. He was not a man who declared himself easily. He was not a man who said things he did not mean, but he was also not a man who said things before he had decided to say them. And she could not yet tell what he was deciding. She was in this state of careful, well-managed uncertainty when he called on a Wednesday, without prior arrangement, unusual for him, and asked, with more visible effort than she had ever seen from him, if she would sit with him. Mrs. Delverton found somewhere to be almost immediately. He sat down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you prefer that." "I do," she said. "I have been thinking about what it would mean to offer you a formal arrangement." He was looking at her steadily. "I don't say this to be cold. I know the word arrangement sounds. I know it's not." He stopped. He started again. "I mean that I want to be honest with you about where I am. I am not a man who says he loves someone lightly. I don't know if I'm there yet, but I know that these past weeks I have felt more present than I have in years, and I know that the thought of you going back to Derbyshire and being only a letter on my writing table is something I find I can't easily accept." Harriet sat with that for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she said, "I want to be equally straightforward with you." "Please," he said, "I have decided several times this season that I was not going to want anything. I was very determined about it." She looked up. "I have not been particularly successful." Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not broadly, but something moved behind his eyes that she thought might have been relief. "I would like us to know each other honestly," he said, "not because it's convenient, and not because the circumstances ask it. I want to know you. Is that something you would allow?" "Yes," she said, "I would allow that." "Then let us begin there." The engagement was not announced for another 6 weeks. Those weeks were the strangest and most particular of her life, not because they were dramatic, but because they were steady in a way she had not known how to expect. He wrote to her when they were not walking together, letters that were direct and sometimes clumsy and entirely without performance. She wrote back in the same spirit. They disagreed about Wordsworth. She found him overwrought. He found her uncharitable. And the disagreement lasted 3 letters and was one of the more enjoyable exchanges she could remember. She met his mother, a dry-humoured woman of 60, who had survived the previous Lord Ashmore through what appeared to be a combination of composure and strategic absence, and who welcomed Harriet by asking her a series of extremely direct questions about estate management, and then declaring, mid-conversation, "Good, you'll do. I was worried he'd bring home someone decorative." Harriet had liked her immediately. The announcement, when it came, was received by most of the county with polite surprise, and, in Mrs. Delverton's house, an amount of quiet weeping that was entirely out of proportion to the situation and deeply appreciated. The difficulty came from a different quarter. Lord Ashmore had a cousin, not a close cousin, but a persistent one, a woman named Mrs. Prendwick, who had been managing to position herself and her daughter within Lord Ashmore's orbit for the better part of 3 years, and who received the announcement with the particular fury of someone who had built an entire private strategy around an outcome that had now failed to materialize. She was, by temperament, too careful to make an open scene. Instead, she conducted a quieter and more precise campaign. The kind of social cruelty that was almost worse for being performed with good manners. She called on Mrs. Delverton. She spoke warmly of Harriet, and damned her comprehensively in the gaps between the warm things, mentioning her reduced circumstances with excessive sympathy, raising the question of her portion with what she framed as concern. She did this in front of 3 other women, which meant it was done in front of 30 people by the end of the week. Harriet heard about it from Mrs. Delverton, who told her with the expression of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have to deliver. She said, Mrs. Delverton reported carefully that she hoped Lord Ashmore had made himself fully aware of the situation, that a man of his position had, well, she used the word responsibilities to the title, and she said she was sure you were a charming girl. Charming girl, Harriet repeated. I know. I'm 29. I know, dear. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Thank you for telling me. Is there anything else? There wasn't. She went upstairs and sat by the window for a while. She was not, she realized, devastated. She was not even particularly shaken. What she was clear-eyed about what had just happened, and clear about what she intended to do, which was nothing. She was not going to chase Mrs. Prendwick's opinion. She was not going to defend herself to the 30 people who had received the edited account. She had spent too many years managing, with what she had to waste energy, managing other people's perceptions. She also wrote to Lord Ashmore, not about Mrs. Prendwick directly. She did not want to position the letter as an alarm. But she told him that she had heard there had been some conversation in the county, and that she wanted him to know she was not concerned, but she thought he ought to be aware. He arrived the next morning without sending word first. She came downstairs to find him in the front parlor, his coat still damp from the ride. He had clearly come fast. You didn't need to come immediately, she said. I know. He didn't look apologetic about it. I received your letter last night, and I was not going to wait another day. She sat down. He remained standing, which was unusual. I want you to tell me directly, he said. What was said? She told him. She was precise about it and unadorned. He listened without expression. When she finished, he said, Mrs. Prendwick's concern for the title has a long history of coinciding with her daughter's prospects. I want you to understand that I'm fully aware of that, and that nothing she has said is new to me. I didn't write the letter to prompt reassurance, Harriet said. I wrote it because I thought you should know. I know you did. He sat down now across from her, leaning forward slightly with his elbows on his knees, in a posture that had nothing of the drawing-room about it. Harriet. It was the first time he had used her name without title. It landed cleanly in the air. I need you to understand something. I am not a person who makes a decision and then needs the world to agree with it in order for me to keep it. I decided to pursue you, and that decision has nothing to do with Mrs. Prendwick or anything she can manage to arrange in a drawing-room. She looked at him steadily. And what will you do? I've already spoken to her husband, he said, politely, but with sufficient clarity. She won't continue. Harriet was quiet for a moment. I could have managed it, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not telling you it required your intervention. I know you could have, he said, but you shouldn't have had to. Not when I was in a position to simply stop it. He paused. There is a difference between managing something alone because you have to, and managing it alone because no one stood beside you. I'm not interested in the second arrangement. She thought about that later, too. The way she thought about the road above Castleton, and his brother, and the way he had said, "There is a difference." They were married in November, at the church near the Delverton house, which was small and cold, and had excellent light through the east windows in the morning. His mother was there, and wept briefly, and looked mortified about it. Mrs. Delverton wept at length, and looked triumphant. Lord Ashmore, Cormac, she was calling him Cormac now, had been calling him that for 3 weeks, and it still felt new and particular in her mouth, stood beside her at the front of the church, and looked at her the way she had come to understand. He looked at things he intended to keep. The estate in Northumberland was larger than she had imagined, and colder and more beautiful and immediately, deeply interesting to her. The house required more management than he had been giving it, which she identified within the first week, and mentioned over dinner on the 8th night. Not as a criticism, but as an observation. He put down his fork and looked at her. "My steward is competent," he said. "He's very competent," she agreed. "He's also managing twice what he should be, because the household accounts haven't been properly organized since your previous housekeeper left. I can fix that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right, that's all," she said. "What else would I say? You're correct. You're nearly always correct about practical things. I've noticed this." He picked his fork back up. "It's useful and occasionally humbling." A real smile, the kind she didn't bother managing. He noticed, because he noticed everything, and something in his expression settled in a way that she was beginning to recognize. Warmth in someone who ran cold. It looked different than warmth in other people. Quieter, more deliberate, more real. By spring, she had reorganized the household accounts, established a better working relationship with the steward, and begun to learn the names of every tenant family on the estate, which was 43 families, and took her the better part of March. By summer she was carrying their first child, which she received with a steadiness that surprised the physician and surprised Cormac somewhat less, because he had by then a clearer idea of her relationship with good news. She didn't perform it. She simply held it carefully and moved forward. He found her in the library on the evening after the physician's visit, sitting by the window with a book she was not reading. He sat beside her. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Not of the obvious things, more of," she paused, finding the word, "hoping. It's still new for me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he took her hand, which he did not do dramatically or with announcement, simply turned it over in his and held it. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You're frightened too." "Yes," he said. He didn't explain it further and didn't need to. She understood it was the same thing. Both of them had spent years in a relationship with loss, and good things arriving still had to pass through that old knowledge before they could fully settle. "We will be careful with it," she said, "and then it will be all right." "Yes," he said, "I think so." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not say anything else. The library was quiet. Outside, the Northumberland summer was doing what northern summers did, blazing briefly and brilliantly before retreating. And the light through the window was the particular gold of late afternoon, long and warm, the kind that feels deliberate. Like something intended. She had not expected any of this, which was, she had come to understand, not the worst way to receive it. She had made her quiet decision at the Caldwell Assembly, and it had turned out to be unnecessary, which was not something she could have predicted, and would not have asked for, and was glad of, deeply and simply glad, in the way that mattered, not loudly, not with performance, just settled in her, a thing that was now simply true. The season would have been long enough either way. As it turned out, it had been exactly long enough.